There's a version of Hollywood history that you were given. The glamour, the golden era fading into the new Hollywood of the 1960s, the counterculture, the blockbusters of the 70s, the excess of the 80s, stars you loved, films you watched with people who are no longer here, an industry that felt, from the outside, like the most exciting place on earth. And then there's the version they didn't give you, the one that was buried, not forgotten, buried. There's a difference. Forgotten means nobody tried to remember. Buried means someone worked to make sure you wouldn't. In this video, we're going to talk about 7 scandals from Hollywood between 1960 and 1990. Not rumors, not gossip. Cases that are documented in court records, FBI files, declassified government documents, and the memoirs of people who were there and waited decades to tell the truth. 7 scandals. 7 cases where the industry either covered its tracks, closed ranks, or simply counted on the fact that enough time would pass that nobody would look too closely. They were wrong about that last part. Here's what we'll be covering today. The Blacklist's hidden victims. The careers destroyed not for any real political reason, but because someone in power wanted them gone. Jean Seberg, the actress the FBI ran a covert disinformation campaign against until she broke completely. Dorothy Dandridge, the first Black woman nominated for Best Actress, abandoned by the industry the moment she was no longer convenient. The Rat Pack's mob connections, what Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. knew about Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit, and why nobody talked about it. Bob Fosse and the women of his productions, what happened behind the scenes of Cabaret in Chicago. Roman Polanski in 1977, not just what he did, but what Hollywood did afterward. And Natalie Wood, what we know now about the night she died that we didn't know then. So sit back, take a moment, and let's talk about what they didn't put in the history books. The 1960s through the 1980s were one of the most creatively extraordinary periods in the history of American film. The old studio system had collapsed. The production code was gone. For the first time, filmmakers had real freedom to tell difficult stories, to work with difficult subjects, to make films that said something real about the world. But the collapse of the old system didn't mean the collapse of the old power structures. The studios were weaker. The individual power players, the directors, the producers, the agents were stronger. And when power concentrates in individuals rather than institutions, the abuses become more personal, more targeted, and often much harder to document. The scandals of this era are different from what came before. They're not about a studio deciding to exploit someone for commercial gain. They're about powerful individuals making decisions, about who gets to work, who gets to be heard, who gets to be believed, with almost no accountability. And in several cases, with the active assistance of the United States government. We start at the beginning, with a system that had been quietly destroying careers since the late 1940s, and whose real victims were still being erased well into the 1960s. When people talk about the Hollywood Blacklist, they talk about Dalton Trumbo, they talk about the Hollywood 10, they talk about the famous names who refused to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee, went to prison for contempt, and eventually, after years in the wilderness, had their careers restored. That story has been told. It has been made into films. It has a reasonably happy ending, at least for some. What hasn't been told, what almost never gets discussed, is what happened to the people who were blacklisted, not because they had any actual communist connections, but because someone in Hollywood wanted them gone. The Blacklist, at its peak in the early 1950s, was supposed to be about identifying genuine communist sympathizers in the film industry. In practice, it became something considerably more useful to considerably more people, a mechanism for settling scores. If you had a grievance against a writer, a director, an actor, a contract dispute, a personal conflict, a professional rivalry. All you needed to do was whisper their name to the right person. Suggest they had attended the wrong meeting. Imply they had signed the wrong petition. You didn't need proof. The accusation was enough. Edward Dmytryk, one of the original Hollywood 10, later described the process with clinical precision. The list wasn't just political, it was personal. People used it to get rid of people they didn't like. The politics were the cover. The politics were the cover. Zero Mostel, the actor and comedian, was blacklisted in 1950. He was not a communist. He had attended some left-leaning social events in the 1940s, the kind that hundreds of people in New York and Hollywood attended without any particular political significance. But he had also made enemies. He was difficult. He was outspoken. He was not the kind of person who made the people in power feel comfortable. He was blacklisted for 7 years. 7 years during which he could not work under his own name, during which his career was systematically dismantled, during which his income disappeared and his mental health deteriorated badly. And Zero Mostel was one of the ones who survived. He came back. He did a funny thing, happened on the way to the forum. He did the producers. He rebuilt. The ones who didn't rebuild, the writers, the directors, the character actors whose names weren't famous enough for their reinstatement to be a story worth telling. Those people are mostly forgotten now. Phil Brown was an actor. Supporting roles, character parts, the kind of work that keeps an industry running. He was blacklisted in 1950. He moved to England. He did not come back to Hollywood for 15 years. By the time he returned, his American career was gone. He is perhaps best known now for a single scene in Star Wars, the uncle who gets killed in the first act, a footnote, a man who had been erased from his own industry. The blacklist officially ended in 1960, when Dalton Trumbo received screen credit for Spartacus. But the mechanisms it had created, the whisper networks, the informal lists, the understanding that an accusation didn't need to be proven to be effective, those mechanisms didn't disappear. They just operated more quietly. The blacklist created a template. The next story shows exactly what happened when the United States government decided to use that template against someone it had decided was inconvenient. Jean Seberg was from Marshalltown, Iowa, small town, ordinary background. She was discovered by director Otto Preminger in a nationwide talent search for the lead in his 1957 film, St. Joan, 17 years old, no acting experience, chosen from 18,000 applicants. She moved to Europe. She made Breathless with Jean-Luc Godard in 1960. Overnight, she became the face of the French New Wave, the American girl who had gone to Paris and become something entirely new. Her image, that t-shirt, that pixie cut, that expression of absolute self-possession, was one of the defining images of the early 1960s. You probably remember her from that. What you probably don't know is what the FBI did to her. Jean Seberg became politically active in the late 1960s. She supported the NAACP. She donated money to the Black Panther Party, legally, openly, the kind of thing that many Americans were doing at the time. She made no secret of her sympathies. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was running a covert program called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, designed to, in Hoover's own words, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize organizations and individuals the Bureau considered threats. The Black Panthers were a primary target, and anyone who supported them was fair game. In 1970, Jean Seberg was pregnant. The FBI, documented in their own internal memos that were later declassified and are now part of the public record, planted a story in the press. The story said that the father of Seberg's unborn child was not her husband, the French novelist Romain Gary, but a member of the Black Panther Party. It was a lie, fabricated, planted deliberately by FBI agents who knew it was false and planted it anyway. The story ran in Joyce Haber's gossip column in the Los Angeles Times in May 1970. Newsweek picked it up. It went international. Jean Seberg, 9 months pregnant, read about herself in the newspaper. She went into premature labor. Her daughter was born 2 days later and died within 2 days of birth. Seberg insisted on an open casket funeral to prove to the world that her child was white. She never recovered. She suffered severe depression in the years that followed, multiple attempts to end her own life, psychiatric hospitalizations. Her career, which had been flourishing in European cinema, collapsed. On September 8, 1979, 9 years to the week after her daughter's death, Jean Seberg was found dead in the back seat of her car in Paris. She had been missing for 10 days. She was 40 years old. Romain Gary held a press conference and said directly, Jean Seberg was destroyed by the FBI. The FBI acknowledged the operation in 1979. An internal bureau document from 1970, later made public, described the Seberg operation explicitly. It noted that the planted story might cause her embarrassment and serve to cheapen her image with the general public. Causing her embarrassment, cheapening her image. The Bureau had fabricated a story about a pregnant woman's unborn child. The child died. The woman spent 9 years falling apart, and the internal memo describes the intended outcome as embarrassment. The Los Angeles Times apologized for running the story. The FBI faced no consequences. What the FBI did to Jean Seberg was a government operation. What Hollywood did to Dorothy Dandridge was something older, quieter, and in some ways more insidious, because it didn't require a conspiracy. It just required the industry to keep doing what it had always done. Dorothy Dandridge was nominated for Best Actress at the 1955 Academy Awards for Carmen Jones, the first Black woman ever nominated in that category. She did not win. Grace Kelly won for The Country Girl. But the nomination itself was historic, a signal. The industry told itself that Hollywood was changing, that talent was talent. What the industry did not say was what it planned to do with Dorothy Dandridge after the cameras stopped rolling. The answer was almost nothing. After the Oscar nomination, Dandridge fought for roles that matched her talent. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most capable actresses working in Hollywood. She had the nomination to prove it. The roles she was offered were variations on a theme: the exotic temptress, the tragic figure, the woman defined by her racial otherness. The roles that would have established her as a mainstream leading actress, the kind Grace Kelly or Audrey Hepburn were making at exactly this moment, were not offered to Dorothy Dandridge. They were not discussed. They were not available. Porgy and Bess in 1959 was supposed to change everything. It didn't. The film disappointed commercially. And in Hollywood, a disappointing film narrows your options. For Dorothy Dandridge, the narrowing was total. By the early 1960s, she was performing in nightclubs, not because she wanted to, because the film work had dried up. A Las Vegas club owner she had trusted with her savings had defrauded her. The money was gone. She was still extraordinary. Performers who saw her in this period described her as one of the greatest nightclub acts they had ever witnessed. But the industry that had used her image to congratulate itself on its progressiveness in 1955 had no interest in her in 1963. On September 8, 1965, Dorothy Dandridge was found dead in her West Hollywood apartment. She was 42 years old. Accidental overdose, a medication interaction with a bone injury. Her estate was worth $600. The woman nominated for an Academy Award 10 years earlier died with $600 to her name. Hollywood noted her passing. There were tributes. There was talk of the tragedy of a wasted talent. Nobody asked who had wasted it. Dorothy Dandridge's story is about what happens when an industry uses someone's image without any intention of sharing its resources. The next story is about something different, about what happens when the industry knows exactly what's going on and decides the box office is more compelling than any of it. If you were alive in the early 1960s, the Rat Pack was everywhere. Frank Sinatra singing My Way like he meant every word of it, because he did. Dean Martin with that glass of what may or may not have been apple juice. So effortlessly charming that the entire room laughed before he'd finished the joke. Sammy Davis Jr., the most purely talented man in any room he walked into. A performer so gifted that even people who had never seen him before understood within 30 seconds that they were watching something rare. The Ocean's 11 films, the Sands residencies, the sense that these men were living a life that the rest of the world could only watch from a distance. You loved them. Most of America loved them. Here's what you weren't told. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Sammy Davis Jr. were, in the early 1960s, the most commercially powerful entertainers in America. They were also, according to FBI files that have since been declassified and run to thousands of pages, deeply connected to organized crime, specifically to Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit. This was not a secret. Exactly. It was an open secret, the kind that everyone in a particular world knows and nobody in that world discusses. The connection between Sinatra and Giancana dated back to the 1940s. Giancana's organization controlled significant portions of the Las Vegas casino industry, the Sands, where the Rat Pack performed their famous residencies, operated with mob money and mob management. Sinatra performed there. He was paid extremely well. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. The FBI began monitoring Sinatra extensively in the late 1950s. The files document meetings, phone calls, shared social events, Sinatra and Giancana dining together, traveling together, attending the same events. In 1960, the connection became politically explosive. John F. Kennedy was running for president. Sinatra organized fundraising for Kennedy's campaign. What Sinatra also did, according to FBI documents and Giancana's own later statements, was serve as an intermediary. Giancana wanted access to the Kennedy administration. He believed his support, and the Chicago outfit's ability to deliver votes in Illinois would be remembered. Kennedy won Illinois by a narrow margin. Robert Kennedy became Attorney General, and Robert Kennedy's Justice Department immediately launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime, including against Sam Giancana. Giancana felt betrayed. He said so explicitly to people who later talked about it. In 1962, President Kennedy canceled a planned stay at Sinatra's Palm Springs compound, a visit Sinatra had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing for. The real reason, which became public years later, was Robert Kennedy's insistence that the president could not be seen at the home of a man with documented mob connections. Sinatra never forgave Kennedy for the cancellation. Hollywood knew about the Giancana connection. The FBI knew. The Kennedy administration knew. The entertainment journalists who covered Sinatra knew. Nobody published it, because the machinery that protected powerful men from the consequences of their associations was still functioning perfectly. Sam Giancana was murdered in his own kitchen in 1975, shot 6 times in the back of the head. The night before, he was scheduled to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee about the CIA's alleged use of mob resources in assassination attempts against Fidel Castro. He never testified. Frank Sinatra received a Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1985. The Rat Pack story is about power protecting itself. The next story is about what happens when the most celebrated director of his generation is also the person no one is willing to hold accountable. Bob Fosse directed Cabaret in 1972, Lenny in 1974, All That Jazz in 1979, a film that is By any reasonable interpretation, a barely fictionalized autobiography in which he portrays himself as a brilliant, self-destructive man who uses and discards women with the systematic efficiency of someone who has learned that his talent grants him unlimited license. All That Jazz was nominated for 9 Academy Awards. It won 4. Hollywood understood exactly what Bob Fosse was saying about himself in that film. They gave it Oscars anyway. The pattern of his behavior toward the women he worked with was, by the 1970s, widely known within the industry. He was not subtle about it. The casting couch as aesthetic principle, the director's personal authority over his dancers and actresses as simply the way things worked in his world. Anne Reinking was one of Fosse's most important creative partners, a dancer and actress of genuine brilliance who was also, for years, his companion. She described the environment of his productions in a 1999 interview with clarity that had become possible only because enough time had passed. She said, "Bob made it very hard to separate the personal from the professional. You were always in both worlds simultaneously, and he made sure of that. The line didn't exist because he erased it deliberately. The line didn't exist because he erased it deliberately. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of method." For the young dancers who came into his productions without Reinking's established reputation, without her ability to navigate him, the dynamic was considerably less equal. Accounts from women who worked in his Broadway productions during the 1970s describe audition processes in which the professional evaluation and the personal attention were conducted simultaneously, in which a young dancer's access to the role depended on her response to the director's interest in her. None of this was hidden. Directors, producers, casting agents, choreographers, the people who worked alongside Fosse knew. It was understood as part of how his world operated. Gwen Verdon, Fosse's wife, the dancer and actress who was arguably his greatest creative collaborator, knew. She made her own calculations. In a 1990 interview, she said, "I understood Bobby. I understood what he needed and what he couldn't help. You either accepted that or you didn't work with him." She paused, then added, "Most people accepted it. Most people accepted it because the alternative was not working with the most important director in American musical theater and film. And for a young dancer in 1972, that alternative was unthinkable." Bob Fosse died of a heart attack in 1987, on the opening night of a revival of Sweet Charity, his own show. Starring Verdon, he was 60 years old. He had been told for years that his lifestyle would kill him. He had put that information into All That Jazz 8 years earlier and made it beautiful. The industry mourned him as a genius. All That Jazz is still taught in film schools. It is still considered a masterpiece. It is also a man telling you exactly who he was and daring you to care. Hollywood didn't care. Bob Fosse operated in an era when a director's talent was considered justification for almost anything. 6 years before Fosse died, that same logic operated in the case that, more than any other, defines Hollywood's willingness to close ranks around a powerful man regardless of what he has done. On March 10, 1977, Roman Polanski was arrested and charged with 5 criminal counts related to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old girl at Jack Nicholson's Los Angeles home. He was 53 years old. The details are in the court record, a public document available to anyone. Polanski pled guilty to 1 count of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor as part of a plea agreement. He pled guilty. In 1978, before sentencing, Roman Polanski fled the United States to France, and Hollywood, with some exceptions, closed ranks around him. The closing of ranks took different forms at different times. In the immediate aftermath, mostly silence, a collective decision not to make his absence from American cinema into a story about what he had done. He was a great director. The work was the work. Over the following decades, as Polanski continued making films in Europe, the industry's relationship with him became something more active than silence. Petitions were signed supporting him. Statements were made calling for his return without consequences. When he won the Academy Award for Best Director for The Pianist in 2003, the audience at the Kodak Theater gave him a standing ovation for a man who had pled guilty to the sexual assault of a child and fled before sentencing. The woman he assaulted, Samantha Geimer, has spoken publicly many times. She has said she does not want Polanski to face further consequences. Her position deserves respect. But this is not a story about what she wants. This is a story about what Hollywood decided, as an institution, to do with the information that one of its most celebrated directors had pled guilty to the sexual assault of a 13-year-old child and evaded justice for decades. What Hollywood decided was to keep working with him, to keep honoring him, to treat the matter as a complicated situation involving a complex man, as though complexity were a defense. It wasn't until 2018, 40 years after Polanski fled, that the Academy expelled him from membership. The vote was not unanimous. He has continued making films. The Polanski case is the clearest example of the principle running through all 7 stories in this video, that in Hollywood, power protects itself, and the price of that protection is paid by the people with the least of it. There is one more story to tell, and unlike the others, it doesn't have a resolution. You grew up with Natalie Wood, Miracle on 34th Street when you were a child, Rebel Without a Cause when you were a teenager, West Side Story when you were a young woman. She was there, across 3 decades, one of the most continuously present faces in American cinema. On the night of November 28th to 29th, 1981, Natalie Wood drowned off the coast of Catalina Island. She was 43 years old. She was on a boat called the Splendor with her husband, Robert Wagner, and her co-star Christopher Walken. The original investigation ruled her death accidental. Case closed, except it wasn't. In 2011, 30 years after her death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation after the boat's captain, Dennis Davern, came forward with a new account. Davern said he had not told investigators everything in 1981. He said there had been an argument on the boat between Wood and Wagner. He said he had heard things that night he had not reported. The Los Angeles County coroner amended her death certificate in 2012. The cause was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The manner of death was changed from accident to undetermined. In 2018, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department named Robert Wagner as a person of interest in the investigation. Not suspect, not charged, person of interest. The physical evidence established that Natalie Wood had bruises on her body inconsistent with simply falling off a boat and drowning. The bruising pattern suggested a physical altercation before she entered the water. The bruises are documented. They are in the record. Dennis Davern said he heard Wagner and Wood arguing loudly that night, that he heard what sounded like a physical confrontation, that he made choices about what to report that he later said he regretted. Christopher Walken has said very little publicly. He was there. He was in his cabin, by his account, when whatever happened, happened. Natalie Wood's body was found floating the following morning, wearing a flannel nightgown and a down jacket. She had not put on a life jacket. She was not dressed to go anywhere. The case is still open. Robert Wagner is 84 years old. He has not been charged with anything. He is legally innocent of any wrongdoing. He is also a person of interest in the investigation into the death of his wife. Those two things can both be true simultaneously. It has been 43 years. 43 years. And the woman who looked at you from the screen in Miracle on 34th Street when you were a child still doesn't have a definitive answer about how she died. 7 scandals, 7 cases where the industry either buried the story, protected the powerful, or simply waited for enough time to pass. The Blacklist destroyed careers through personal vendettas, dressed up as political necessity. The people who weaponized it faced no consequences. Jean Seberg was targeted by a government program that fabricated a story about her unborn child. The child died. The FBI called the intended outcome embarrassment. Dorothy Dandridge became the first Black woman nominated for Best Actress and was abandoned within a decade, not dramatically, but quietly. Through the accumulated weight of doors not opened, she died with $600. The Rat Pack's connections to Sam Giancana were documented by the FBI, known by the press, understood by everyone in a position to report it. Nobody reported it. Sinatra received a Presidential Medal of Freedom. Bob Fosse told you exactly who he was in all that jazz, erased the line between professional and personal, by design for decades, and Hollywood gave him Oscars for the honesty. Roman Polanski pled guilty and fled before sentencing, 25 years later. The Academy gave him a standing ovation, and Natalie Wood drowned on a boat with her husband in 1981, and the manner of her death is still officially undetermined, and the case is still open. These are not ancient history. Some of the people involved are still alive. Some of the institutions involved still exist. You followed these careers, you watched these films, you were part of the audience that made all of this possible. You deserve to know the full picture. For a long time. Hollywood counted on the fact that you wouldn't.